Hello, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to part 2 of this video tutorial on using the Adobe Camera Raw interface. In this part of the tutorial, we'll be making a basic conversion of a raw image file and demonstrating how some relatively minor alterations to the adjustment sliders under the Basic tab can have quite a dramatic impact on the pixels in an uncompressed raw image file. On screen, we have two examples of the same image file. The image on the left hand side is an unprocessed raw file as it was shot by the camera, whereas the image on the right has been processed in Adobe Camera Raw, and as you can see, significant adjustments to the exposure, contrast and colour saturation can be made. And the key point to mention here is all of these adjustments are completely non-destructive, and they don't negatively affect or permanently change the information within the pixels. So all our adjustments are reversible, and in theory we could convert a raw file in hundreds of different ways and produce hundreds of different versions of the same shot, all from one image file. Okay, enough talking, let's get started. Start by opening the image cliff_bay.dng of this month's free CD into either Elements or the full version of Photoshop. I'm using Photoshop Element 6, but if you have a different version, the interface might look slightly different. Don't worry though, the controls are pretty similar, if not identical, so you'll be able to follow the tutorial all the same. The first thing we're going to do is recompose our original raw image using the crop and straighten tools from up here on the toolbar. This may seem like an odd place to start, but if you think about it, is there any point making adjustments to areas that we don't want to keep? Of course not, and by cropping them out first, we ensure those unwanted pixels don't influence any other adjustments we might make later on. So it's better to get them out of the picture now. We don't want to change the aspect ratio of our image, however. So by clicking and holding down on the crop icon, we can select an aspect ratio from the menu. I'm going to select 3:2, which is the same aspect that my Nikon D300 captures images in, and this ensures the proportions of our crop will be restrained. Next, click on the Straighten tool, or if you're a fan of keyboard shortcuts, just press the letter A on the keyboard and that will also select the Straighten tool. Now just draw a line along the line of the sea and the base of the cliffs, which is the line that we want to be straight in our image. Once you're happy with the line, then just release your mouse and a crop box pops up that's automatically rotated to straighten up the horizon. Now we just want to recompose the image to better frame this foreground interest, so just click within the crop box and I'm just going to drag the crop box to the left just to frame that rock a little bit better. And now it's filling the bottom of the frame nicely. I can just hit the return key and that'll apply my crop. And there you go, you can see that we've really straightened up the image. Now before making any tonal or colour adjustments, it's a good idea to activate the histogram clipping warnings, which is done simply by clicking on these upward facing arrows in the image histogram, with the arrow on the left to flag up the shadows clipping warning and the arrow on the right to flag up the highlights. And you'll know that these clipping warnings are active when you get this thin white stroke line around the arrow box. And if we make some fairly radical alterations to the exposure and the black sliders, you can see that those highlight and shadow clipping warnings are visible on the image preview, with the red block areas advising where we've clipped the highlights and the blue block areas showing where we've clipped the shadows. Okay, I'll just return the blacks and the exposure back to their default settings. Right, so now the image is cropped and the clipping warnings are activated, we can turn our attention to the main tonal and colour adjustments using these adjustment sliders under the Basic tab. First we're going to change the white balance to warm the image up, because as you can see, the auto white balance setting that I've used on the camera has made the image look fairly cold. Now we could alter the white balance using the white balance tool, which I explained in part 1, but we also have access to a range of white balance presets, which you can choose between by clicking on the downward arrow in the white balance box. Now this image was captured on a fairly cloudy day, so if I just select the cloudy white balance preset, you can see that's really warmed the image up, and the colour temperature of the image has been increased to 6,500 degrees Kelvin. And if you wanted to further fine tune this colour temperature, you can do that just by using the slider, shifting it to the right to further warm the image up, or back to the left to cool it down. But I'm quite happy with that cloudy preset, so I'm going to leave it at 6,500. Underneath the temperature slider, the tint slider compensates for any green or magenta colour cast, with green being to the left and magenta to the right. The tint slider was really designed to help fine tune the white balance temperature on images which have been shot under fluorescent or mixed lighting conditions. So if you're working with a daylight or flash shots, you can pretty well leave this alone unless there's an obvious magenta green cast that needs to be removed. So I'm just going to leave mine to +10. Okay, so now we can move on to the main meat of a raw conversion, which involves using the adjustment sliders in the bottom section of this palette to adjust the exposure, contrast and colour saturation of the image. If we take a close look at our image histogram, it's apparent in this image there aren't too many pixels at the brightest end of the tonal register. So I'm going to increase the exposure by just say a quarter of a stop, just to brighten up the image a little bit. And you can see that as we adjust the exposure slider, the image histogram changes. I don't want to go too far because I'm suffering a fair bit of burnout in the sky, so I'm just going to leave it at plus 0.25, which has resulted in a little bit of burnout there just above the cliff, but don't worry, we're going to come back and address that a little bit later on. The image is still looking pretty flat though, and as you can see, again looking at the histogram, all of our tones are sort of bunched up on the right hand side here, and we don't have too many tones in the dark regions. So let's pep up the contrast a little bit by increasing the black slider up to around a setting of 30, which is just going to darken down the image. And there you go, you can see the contrast is looking much better already. Arguably, we'd want to push the blacks even further to make that sky look a lot more dramatic. However, because our raw conversion adjustments are applied globally, doing so would result in large sections of the cliff and the foreground rock becoming completely blocked out, which is to be avoided. So the aim of our raw conversion is to get the best starting point with a good range of tones across the image, and then we can make more localized adjustments to areas like the sky later in Photoshop. Now I'm going to increase the contrast even further by using the contrast slider, and I'm going to increase that to around +50, and we can add even more depth to the tonal range by using the clarity slider. I'm going to increase the clarity to around +50 in this conversion, and a handy tip when you're using the clarity slider is if you zoom in tightly on a contrast edge, like here between the sky and the cliff, you can make sure that no haloing is occurring where dark and light pixels meet. If you do see a halo, then you've pushed clarity too far and you should rein it back a little bit. But as you can see, a setting of +50 looks fine on this image. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out using the zoom controls in the bottom left hand corner here, and if I just click on the downward arrow I can select fit in view. And now we've pumped up the contrast sufficiently without blocking out the shadows or burning out the highlights too much, and we can come back to address those highlight and shadow clipping warnings that we've got just in the cliff and up in the sky. And now actually we've got a little bit of a highlight warning down on some of the tones in the sand. As long as you're using a more modern version of Photoshop, it's easy to pull back details into these areas using the recovery and fill light sliders. If these sliders are not available in your version of Camera Raw, then the only option you have is to be slightly more restrained with the exposure and black slider, and then pep up contrast more selectively in Photoshop later on. Now the recovery slider will bring back detail into my burnt out highlights, and you can see that if I move the slider to the right, the clipping warnings start to dissipate, and by the time I get to 15, the clipping warnings have been removed completely. So we can now be confident that we've got detail in all of those tones in the sky and down on the beach. Next, the fill light slider will do the same thing but for the shadows, just bringing back detail into those very dark areas in the cliff. We're going to need to push this a bit further, and you can see that even when I get up to a setting of around 30, we've still got a slight clipping warning there in the very darkest part of the cave. Now, to get rid of that completely, I'm going to need to pump up the fill light to, well, up to anywhere around sort of 70. But as you can see, that's making the image look pretty flat and washed out again. I'm going to knock back the fill light slider back to around 30, which ensures that we don't have any large areas of burnt out shadows, but at the same time our image has still got some punch. Okay, our basic raw conversion is nearly complete now, and the final two sliders, vibrance and saturation, both boost the vividness of colours, with vibrance having more of an effect on unsaturated colours, where the saturation slider boosts all colours within the image. Use these sliders with a little caution to avoid oversaturating the colour and creating a garish or unnatural look. So a setting of around 10 for vibrance and 10 for saturation is plenty for this shot. Just having a look at my image preview again, you can see that by boosting the vibrance and the saturation sliders, we've actually now brought a little bit of burnout back into the highlights. So I'm going to go back to my recovery slider, and I'm just going to increase that to around a setting of 20, which has just removed that burnout from the cliff. And there we have it. We've converted our raw file, and now all we need to do is hit Open Image to open the shot in Photoshop Elements. So as you can see, working with raw image files and making a good conversion in Camera Raw before opening the image into Photoshop gives us lots more control to fine-tune the raw image data in the way that we choose, rather than leaving it to the camera's image processor. A raw conversion just gives us a better initial starting place, however, and as I said earlier, adjustments are applied globally, so you'll often want to manipulate the converted image later in Photoshop and make more selective adjustments to boost the contrast. In this shot, for example, I want to boost the sky a bit more. So let's make a very rough selection of the sky using the polygonal lasso tool. Don't need to be too accurate, I just want to go a little bit above the cliff here. That's looking pretty good. Back to the beginning. And then I need to feather my selection so that we've got a nice graduated blend. So up to the select menu, down to feather, and a feather radius of around 75 pixels will be good. I'll just click OK. And now I can apply a levels adjustment just to the sky. I'm going to do that with an adjustment layer, so I need to have my layers palette open. I can activate it by going up to the window menu and down to layers. You can see that it opens it on the right hand side of the screen there. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so I can see my complete image. So if I just click on the half black half white circle at the top of the layers palette, I then select levels from the flyout menu, and you can see from our histogram that our selection of the sky only has pixels bunched up on the right hand side of the image histogram, indicating that we've got no darker tones at all in the sky. And that's because in our raw conversion we couldn't push the contrast in the sky hard enough without completely blocking out the shadows in the foreground rock and the cliff. So by clicking and dragging the black point slider, I can darken down the sky. I just want to move the back point slider right to the start of the pixels on the histogram, and there you go, you can see that we've got a much punchier sky. I'm just going to click OK to accept that levels adjustment, and already with that one simple adjustment we've now got a much more dramatic shot. I also want to add some more definition to this foreground rock, however, and to do that I'm going to use the burn tool. It's always a good idea to apply any dodging and burning to a separate layer. So first, over in my layers palette, I'm just going to duplicate my background layer just by dragging it over the create new layer icon, and then over in the toolbox I can select my burn tool. Now it's hidden just underneath my dodge tool, so I can get the flyout menu just by holding down my left mouse, and I'm going to select the burn tool. I can configure my burn tool brush up here in the options bar, so I want a large soft edge brush. 500 pixels will be about right. I'm going to set my range to mid-tones and an exposure of 4%. You always want to keep the exposure quite low and build up the effect gradually rather than rushing in with a very high exposure value. So with everything configured, I can now just sweep my brush over the foreground rock, and that will just darken down the mid-tone areas. There we go, starting to look a bit better. The effect will build up gradually and quite subtly because we've got that low exposure value, but already that's looking a lot better. I'm now just going to switch over and burn in the shadows. So I'm going to change the range to shadows. I'm going to leave the exposure at a low value of 4%, but I need a smaller brush just because I want to work intricately around some of these lines and soft shadow areas, and I can change my brush size just by hitting the left hand square bracket key on the keyboard. Something around a 150 pixel brush looks much better. And now again, holding down my mouse button, I can just work my burn tool around some of the lines in the rock and these sort of soft shadow areas just to bring out the definition in the rock, boost the contrast and make it look a little bit more appealing here in the foreground. There we go, so it's quite quick work. Don't need to be too accurate, just run very roughly over these sort of shadow areas. I'm just going to burn in the base of the rock here, make it stand out from the sand. And there you go. If I toggle on and off my burn layer, you can see the difference that's made, just to really boost the contrast, making that rock a lot more vivid in the foreground. And there you go. Once you're happy with your adjustments in Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, then you can just go up to the File menu and click Save As, and save your image as a Photoshop document if you want to retain your adjustment layers, or just flatten the image and then you can save it as a compressed JPEG file. Okay, I hope you've really enjoyed this video tutorial on making a basic RAW conversion. Give it a go using the start image from off the CD, and then get shooting and converting RAW in the future. Cheers!